Do you know what the best platform closers, speakers, and sales pros have in common? That's right, storytelling. The ability to tell stories that draw people in and engage with their audience. That's what makes for a killer sales performance. See, over the past few weeks, I've had the opportunity to get onto different stages and speak at different events. And most recently, I spoke at my buddy, who's also my client, Mr. King Keto, Brandon Carter's high ticket trainer group. I was privileged enough to be able to deliver a webinar. What that means is I was able to deliver a sales pitch for my program, the virtual selling system. And with Brandon, we launched it to about 120 people live. Before the webinar, I practiced and practiced. I watched Russell Brunson stuff. I'm in his inner circle, so I took all his content, right? I prepared my webinar, and by the way, it went good. Like, I did great. And Brandon said, yeah, Joel, you did good. But there was one thing that I was missing to go from good to great. What could have even bumped up our conversions from the event. And that was my stories were okay, they were good, but they weren't great. So let me break that down for you. This is actually from Michael Haig, who actually was Hollywood screenwriter who wrote films like I Am Legend and Hitched. And that basically was for Will Smith. So he has so much experience writing stories that make audience members in the cinema cry in their seats. And I'm gonna give you the 6 parts to what makes a good story, especially in business and sales. And then I'm gonna show you what I did wrong or what I did not so well that I'm gonna improve in the future. Okay, sounds good? Here we go. Okay, so this was given to me by Michael at Russell's Inner Circle a few weeks ago. And this actually is his 6-step success stories. Step 1, your setup. Michael talks about introducing your hero. So when I was doing my presentation with Brandon, my hero was myself. And I gave the story like this. I'm gonna deliver it to you the way I delivered it to Brandon's audience. Keep in mind, I had slides then and now I don't, but we'll just go off the riff. So I said, how many of you, when you were young, you were dreaming of becoming something or someone powerful or known, or you had great goals for your life? And everyone in the audience was like, me, right? Type in the chat, what did you want to become when you were young? Then people were saying things like astronaut, doctor, policeman. And so for me, I wanted to be a policeman and an astronaut when I was young. But you know what? I have never heard a kid, a baby, put up their hands and say, Mommy, I want to be a salesperson when I grow up, right? How many of you wanted to be a salesperson when you grew up? Nobody. See, today, sales has such a bad rep. People think of sales and they think of, oh, used car sales guy, slimy, sleazy, pushy, aggressive closer. Now, when I was young, and this is where I showed them my slides, this is me at my aunt's wedding as the ring bearer. This is me when I graduated kindergarten. I showed them a photo of my dad. My dad has been in insurance sales for over 30 years with my mom, and I love them to bits. They've been doing insurance their whole lives. Now, when I grew up, that actually got me terrified of sales because I watched how my parents would work long and they sacrificed for me and they took care of me, but they would work long hours. My dad would travel and they weren't at home for me all the time, right? And I had to go to my grandparents' house. And I just grew up not always having parents all the time. Like my dad especially was busy working. I never wanted to do sales growing up. To me, I was going away from sales. It's actually funny. If I stayed in Malaysia, I would probably, well, at least my parents would probably want me to run their insurance business today. And I probably would have no choice because it's not bad. It's a lucrative business. Sales was the furthest thing away from my mind. You know what I mean? Like, who here feels like they never wanted to do sales? How many of you don't even like sales? Right, so the chat was blowing up, right? Like me, I don't want to do sales, right? And keep in mind, I was speaking to an audience of fitness trainers who were selling their fitness programs, right? And I was just an ordinary kid born in Malaysia, grateful and had the privilege to be able to go to the US because here's the funny part. Like this way I showed a meme of like Asian kids. So they're like, what are the 4 jobs you can be, right? Doctor, lawyer, engineer. And then the last one was disgrace to the family. So it's like, yeah, you can only be these 3 things. And I told my mom and my dad like, hey, Mom, Dad, I want to be a doctor. No more astronaut, I want to be a doctor. And that actually opened the door for me to go to the US because my college at that time, Junior College, had a special program for people like me who were foreigners, but also younger, who had not completed a high school diploma. We could do high school and college at the same time, but I could do it because my mom allowed me to go because I wanted to be a doctor. So that's when I went to the US and everything was great. But then I realized something. I looked around my peers. And have you ever had the feeling where you look around a room and you realize that everyone in the room has so much blessings and opportunities in their life, they're taking it for granted? I felt the same way. I looked at all my American peers and I thought to myself, man, if I was an American, this is what I would do. I would play all out, I would live my life, I would do everything. I would not waste my life because I looked at the public transportation. Everything was amazing here. I looked at the healthcare. Even though healthcare is expensive, it's still good quality. I looked at schools. I looked at food. I looked at everything. And I was like, man, I wish I could become an American, or at the very least, I wish I could stay in this country. That dream came true. Back in 2015, I enlisted into the US Army Reserves. I joined, I actually graduated, became a US citizen, became a soldier in the US Army, and then my dreams came true. So I want you to type in the chat, full potential, because life is all about living to your full potential. So I realized I made a promise to myself. If I became an American, I will have to live to my max potential, to my full potential, and it happened. So from then on, I went to my full potential. Now I'm gonna pause the story here a little bit. That was like the first 5 to 10 minutes of my story I told. I would say a lot better on camera then because I had my slides in front of me, and also I was standing up and the crowd was, very engaged, right? It was good, but see, the story wasn't great though. So what is missing in that story that makes it a great story? So going back, the second step from Michael is crisis. It's a new event that moves the hero to action. In my story, what was my crisis? Well, I didn't really have a crisis. I just didn't like sales. That isn't deep enough or emotional enough to pull feelings from. That's basically what Brandon said, which I agree, by the way. A better way I could tell my story, and I want to thank my wife, Jaden, for this, because she told me like, yeah, Joel, when you tell your story, really the most painful story that I have is how we fought a lot to the point of getting divorced multiple times in my sales career. That should have been my story. But instead I used a different story when I was younger, how I hated sales, how I didn't want to do insurance, how I wanted to come to America. And it's very long, but it's also not very emotional. And I don't think a lot of people can relate to that, because how many people like immigrated to a new country and joined the military? I'm sure there are people that do that and they become like successful, but that's not the rags to riches story that most people hear. But imagine if I said, 2 years ago, I remember back in 2021, I was sitting in my room, depressed, sad. I was just crying. My knuckles were bleeding because I punched the wall before. And I was contemplating ending my life because I just had so much pain and frustrations and fights about my career. And how many of you felt that way? How many of you been through that? Because imagine if I started with that story, which was true, by the way. Can you feel the difference in emotion? The difference between a good story and a great story. Right? So I learned something really good, and that's why I want to share this with you as well so you can implement this in your business. The third thing that Michael talks about is pursuit. Pursuit basically means now that we found the system, the solution, the hero is now looking for that solution. That's what pursuit means. And for me, it was the virtual selling system, which is my sales training program. I took all these sales courses, paid all this money, and I still couldn't figure out how to close well. In fact, I got fired from multiple positions, and at my favorite position with my first mentor, Dan Locke, at the peak of my career, I was about to be let go. And on top of that, my wife and I were not happy. We were fighting a lot in our relationship and marriage. See, that's the pursuit in the moment of crisis. And also, I can now talk about how I discovered the virtual selling system. Then what happened was I learned the key thing in the virtual selling system, which is how to actually read people. So the pursuit, one of the methods of how I got better was I started realizing that sales is nothing more than human psychology. Sales is just about having high EQ and high social awareness. If you can read people, you don't really need fancy sales skills and techniques. If you can read people, you can then talk to people the way they want to be talked to. When I was in the High Ticket Closer program by Dan Locke taught the Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, and Pearl method, which is really cool. There's actually a better method, which is the reason why is because you can actually take a test online and actually like have people test it and test yourself. It's really simple. It's the DISC assessment. You can take it, it's a free test. And literally everyone in the world has a high letter, D-I-S-C, and a secondary letter. So for me, I'm high D, I'm also high I. So what that means is I'm very goal-driven, I'm straight to the point, I cut straight to the chase, right? I wanna get results, it's about numbers and success and money. And then I'm also high I, which means I'm extroverted, high energy, right? Enthusiastic. I can be annoying, irritating. Everyone fits into D, I, S, or C. And so when I learned how to read people, thanks to Dan, thanks to this, thanks to all these personality assessments, that changed my life. And that's actually one of the core things in the virtual selling system, is learning how to read people using psychometrics or psychology. So see, that's pursuit. Michael also then goes into conflict. Conflict is where the main source of emotion comes in the story. So when I talked about how I was fighting with my wife, wanting to get divorced, and we were unhappy for a few years, I would have gone deeper into the conflict. Because in my first story with Brandon, there was no conflict. Brandon's story is incredible. Brandon's dad, his dad got shot in the head. I mean, come on. There isn't more conflict than that. What is missing in my story, which is why I didn't make a good story, was I didn't have that conflict. I had this question for the longest time. I used to ask this to Jaden all the time, like, hey, you know, babe, my life, I don't really have a lot of painful stories. I don't really have a lot of these kind of things. And I don't want to lie to people. I don't want to say like, oh, I just make something up, like, oh, I got hit by a car. I don't want to say that. I don't want to make stuff up. She actually helped me point out things in life where it doesn't have to be painful. It doesn't have to be like dramatic, that someone's gonna die, but I think it just has to be real and raw. Because the truth is, if you think back to your past, you had hard situations. Everyone goes through hard situations, right? There's nobody on this planet that just goes through life with no pain, no fear, and no mistakes. So if I have to be honest with myself, I could think of multiple times in my life, just besides fighting and getting divorced, right? That part, I have multiple moments where I had pain too. So don't make the excuse, say, oh, I have nothing, right? My life is pretty good, right? Even if your life is pretty good, you can still tell a great story. And your conflict might be this. It might be, everyone told me that I needed to share something painful and hurtful, but I don't have any, and that's my conflict. Do you know how it feels to not have a rags to riches story? You know how it feels when everyone's like, oh, you just got it easy. You grew up with silver spoon in your mouth. You know how it feels to have people judge, right? Like, that's a conflicting story too. So, step 5 is now the climax. So the climax is how the hero finds their success. So for me, when I talk about my climax is when I made my first $100,000 in sales in my first year with sales commissions. And to this date, I've earned over $500,000 from sales calls, from leading sales team. And that is my climax. Because of what I've done and what skill I achieved, thanks to the virtual selling system, I have now got a climax. So I've now got a gain. Michael then says the final step you need to tell a good story is what's the aftermath. And this part I did pretty well in my presentation. I showed pictures of like me in a TV studio. I showed pictures of me going to Mexico, right? Pictures of me flying first class, pictures of me with all these nice cars. What is the life that your audience wants to have after you achieve the climax? So that's the story arc, right? So let me recap this again. Step 1, you got the setup, yourself the hero. Step 2, you have what they call crisis. That leads the hero to pursuit, starting to find a solution. Then there is conflict, drama. Then there is a climax. The hero beats the bad guy. And then finally, there is the life of the hero after the climax. I call them story selling because literally when we tell stories, they are to sell. When we tell stories, the purpose of them is to sell, to persuade, to convince, to inspire. So if you found these story selling tips helpful, then make sure you follow me and click the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you can learn more sales tips to scale your sales and scale your business. Don't forget, check the link in my description below and book a time with myself or my team if you want to learn about the virtual selling system or how we can turn your dead leads into more sales. Talk soon.